March 11, 1945. Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. The dawn light spread across the cracked concrete runway, where exhausted mechanics wrung pine roots into crude distillation vats, straining for drops of oil to feed the dying war machine. In the command post, the hand of an intelligence officer shook as he studied periscope photographs delivered from submarine I-47. The images showed something incomprehensible. A massive barge floating near Ulithi Atoll, built from concrete, unarmed, its deck crowded not with weapons but refrigeration pipes and cooling vents. Dozens of smaller craft ferried mysterious white containers to waiting warships. The officer's notation in the logbook was precise, clinical, yet betraying disbelief. Concrete vessel observed, heavy refrigeration equipment, transfers constant, classification, unknown logistics vessel. That vessel was not carrying ammunition, nor fuel, nor medical stores. It was producing ice cream. In the skies above, 24 Yokosuka P-1Y-1. Francis bombers sat lined for Operation Tan No. 2, their young pilots, many with fewer than 50 hours of training, preparing for one-way missions into the heart of the American fleet at Ulithi. They strapped themselves into cockpits with explosives lashed beneath their wings, reciting death poems and clutching thousand-stitch belts sewn by mothers and sisters. On the same horizon where they would fall in fire, a floating factory was churning out 10 gallons of frozen dessert every 7 minutes, around the clock, day and night. For Japan, every resource had already been bled dry. Aviation fuel was so scarce that the battleship Yamato conducted training exercises at anchor to conserve oil. A desperate program employing 34,000 distillation units and mobilizing 400,000 workers, including millions of schoolchildren, scraped pine roots to create a few thousand barrels of substitute fuel, bar sound, nearly enough for days of combat. Mechanics siphoned alcohol from industrial thermometers to keep engines running. Pilots weakened by malnutrition reported failing eyesight and trembling hands as their bodies withered under rations of rice and dried fish. Yet in the American Pacific, a different kind of war was being fought. At Ulithi, in a lagoon holding more ships than the entire Imperial Navy at its peak, an ice cream barge worth $1 million produced 5 tons of dessert every day. Destroyer crews without machines of their own sent boats with empty containers, returning with gallons of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. From admirals to deckhands, the frozen cream was shared equally, a ritual of abundance that defied the Japanese understanding of warfare. For the men at Kanoya, facing death in fuel-starved bombers, the realization was unbearable. They were preparing to die against an enemy who brought dessert to the apocalypse. At Ulithi Atoll, the heart of the Pacific Fleet, the ocean shimmered like a mirror of steel. Anchored across 22 miles of turquoise water were more than 700 American ships, carriers bristling with Hellcats and Avengers, battleships that dwarfed anything afloat, tankers pumping rivers of oil, floating dry docks swallowing destroyers whole. It was a sight so vast, so unimaginable, that even the reconnaissance pilots of the Imperial Navy reported it as an island of ships. The atoll had become an artificial metropolis of war, one that could repair, fuel, arm and relaunch an entire navy without returning to the mainland. Hidden among these giants, tied to a modest pier of the service anchorage, was a vessel the Japanese could never have conceived, a concrete barge, 265 feet long, its deck crowded not with guns but with refrigeration compressors, cooling tanks, and pipes humming with Freon. It was the Navy's floating ice cream factory, a project born in secrecy after officers in Washington determined that morale was as critical to victory as ammunition. The machine produced 10 gallons of frozen dessert every 7 minutes, a steady rhythm of luxury in the middle of annihilation. To American sailors, this was more than a treat. It was survival of the spirit. Crews who returned from kamikaze raids, their ships scarred and their shipmates buried at sea, stood in line for a tin cup of sweetness that reminded them of home. Men spoke of it as though it were medicine, a taste of childhood, a promise that life existed beyond the horizon of war. Even admirals ate shoulder to shoulder with stokers and gunners, the ice cream dispensed without rank, without distinction. In that frozen scoop was a message. The United States had not only the strength to fight, but the abundance to comfort. On the other side of the ocean, the Japanese pilots at Kanoya received a different message, and their commanders briefed them with grainy photographs of Ulithi, images of carriers, cruisers, and mysterious vessels. One officer wrote in his diary, "The enemy enjoys luxuries we cannot imagine. They fight with machines and cold sweetness, while we offer only our bodies." The ice cream barge, in its own strange way, became a weapon of psychological warfare. Because in war, symbols can wound as deeply as steel. To one side it was joy frozen in a cup. To the other it was proof that they were fighting a nation that could afford to make ice in the middle of the Pacific, while Japan's children dug up pine roots for fuel. Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu. The hangars reeked of pine smoke and alcohol, a bitter scent that clung to every ragged mechanic's uniform. Outside, rows of P-1Y-1 Francis twin-engine bombers sat with patched wings and stripped-down frames, their bellies packed with explosives for one-way strikes. The fuel in their tanks was not aviation gasoline. It was pine root oil, scraped from the earth by the hands of schoolchildren. Across Japan, thousands of distillation pits belched smoke where farmers, housewives, and even orphans fed roots into crude stills, boiling sap for drops of substitute fuel. It was an empire's last resource, extracted from the soil itself, a nation burning its own future to stay alive one more day. Pilots knew what this meant. The engines coughed on the synthetic mixture, sputtering like sick lungs. The smell inside the cockpits burned their throats, and the controls vibrated with irregular tremors. Training flights were often cancelled because engines seized in mid-air, forcing crews to glide to a crash landing or die in a fireball. Yet the High Command insisted these planes would strike terror into the Americans at Ulithi, a sacrifice that might stall the inevitable. The irony was that the men chosen to fly them were often boys, some barely 18, with fewer than 50 flight hours. They were told their deaths would be blossoms falling honorably for the emperor. But blossoms did not die with hunger in their bellies. These pilots were gaunt, their cheeks sunken, their muscles weak from rations of millet and dried fish. Many could not see clearly. Malnutrition blurred their eyesight, their hands trembled on the yokes. Their farewell photographs, taken before missions, show thin faces forced into smiles, while their mothers' parting gifts, sashes stitched with 1,000 prayers, were wrapped around torsos destined never to return. The commanders tried to mask despair with ceremony. Sake cups were raised before dawn departures, though often the bottles were watered down or replaced entirely with vinegar. The young men bowed, shouted "Tenno Heika Banzai," and climbed into cockpits they knew were coffins. Engines wheezed to life on pine root fuel, propellers chopping the cold air, and one by one they lifted toward Ulithi, toward a horizon crowded with ships that lived in another world. A world where sailors ate ice cream under palm trees, a world where morale was measured in sugar, milk, and refrigeration, not in the blood of boys. Ulithi Atoll was unlike anything the Pacific had ever seen. From the sky, its turquoise lagoon looked serene, a necklace of coral islands circling calm water. But within that calm sat an armada so vast it seemed impossible, more ships than the entire Japanese navy had left afloat. Aircraft carriers with flight decks stretching like steel highways, battleships resting like giants, destroyers darting between them, tenders and repair ships forming a floating industrial zone. At night, the lagoon glowed with the light of welders and arc lamps, entire shipyards alive upon the sea. Ulithi was not a base, it was a city that floated. For sailors, it was both fortress and sanctuary. Shore leave meant tiny islets where men played baseball on sandy clearings or stretched beneath coconut palms. Floating cinemas projected films against stretched canvas screens. Chaplains led services on weathered decks. And always there was ice cream, hauled by launches from the barge, carried in steel tubs back to carriers and battleships. Sailors described eating it under starlight, the tropical air heavy with salt, the sweetness on their tongues feeling like a direct message from home. The Japanese could scarcely believe it. Intercepted reconnaissance reports marveled not only at the sheer number of ships, but at the presence of what they called luxury vessels. A diary from a Japanese intelligence officer captured the bitterness. The enemy fights a war of abundance. They do not fear hunger nor despair. They can make ice in the middle of the ocean while our children dig roots from the earth. For American commanders, this abundance was no accident. Morale was a weapon. Planners knew that a sailor who fought with his stomach full, who remembered what home tasted like, could endure endless months at sea. The ice cream barge was not simply a treat, it was policy. It was as vital to the Issue fleet as ammunition depots or oilers. Because in total war, survival depended not only on steel and firepower, but on the will to keep fighting, and the will to fight was sweetened quite literally by sugar and cream. For the pilots at Kanoya preparing to launch into death on pine fuel fumes, the thought of such an enemy gnawed at the soul. To die against a nation that lived in plenty was not merely defeat, it was humiliation. The war was no longer just about territory or honor. It was about survival against an empire that had turned even ice into a weapon. Kanoya, April 1945. Dawn crept over the airfield, a pale light stretching across the rows of bombers waiting like coffins with wings. On the tarmac, young men in flight gear bowed to their commanders. Some clutched letters folded carefully into breast pockets, final words for mothers who would never see them again. Others recited poems they had written the night before, verses about cherry blossoms, rivers, or the honor of vanishing into flame. The ritual was practiced, solemn, but beneath the chants of banzai, there was silence in their eyes. Mechanics scrambled, pouring the pine root fuel into engines that sputtered and smoked before finally roaring to life. The smell was acrid, choking, yet it was all they had left. Each plane carried a payload of 1,760 pounds of explosives, enough to tear a carrier apart if it struck true. The pilots strapped themselves in, some with talismans sewn by their mothers, others with photographs of sweethearts tucked against the throttle. They knew the truth. These were one-way flights. As the bombers rose, their wings wobbling under the strain of synthetic fuel, the base fell silent. On the ground, comrades stood at attention, watching the silhouettes climb into the clouds, knowing they would never return. The sky swallowed them, one by one. Hours later, above Ulithi, the American fleet stirred. Lookouts spotted dark shapes cutting low across the horizon. Enemy bombers, diving fast, too fast. Alarms rang. Anti-aircraft guns erupted, tracers streaking the blue sky with fire. Sailors scrambled to stations as kamikazes plunged. One bomber smashed into the ammunition ship USS Mount Hood, the blast ripping a column of flame into the sky. Another tore into the carrier USS Randolph, killing 25 men, wounding over 100. The sea boiled with oil and burning wreckage. For the Japanese pilots, this was their blossom, death in flame, searing into memory. But even as the shock tore through the fleet, the Americans recovered with terrifying speed. Damage crews swarmed, hoses doused flames, and within hours Randolph was patched, her decks cleared, her planes flying again. Destroyers ferried wounded sailors to hospital ships. And as evening fell, launches once more approached the ice cream barge, filling containers for waiting crews. The message was brutal. Even under kamikaze fire, the Americans could absorb destruction, repair themselves, and return to routine. The suicide of Japan's youth struck hard, but not hard enough to shake a navy that still had sweetness left to spare. In the aftermath of those kamikaze strikes, silence spread across Japan's barracks and villages. Official communiques declared success. Enemy carrier damaged, hundreds killed, blossoms fall with honor. Families were told their sons had struck decisive blows, that their sacrifice had bought time for the empire. But in the private pages of diaries, the truth leaked out like blood through cloth. One pilot's farewell entry, recovered from his quarters, read, "I do not believe we can stop them. Their ships return even after fire. I wonder if the sea itself fights for America. Yet I cannot shame my family. Tomorrow I will die." Another, only 19, wrote of hunger more than fear. "My head feels light. I have not eaten meat in weeks. I think of the enemy, eating sugar. My body is thin, but it must carry this plane to its death." The contrast was unbearable. At Ulithi, the Americans treated the ice cream barge as an afterthought, almost invisible in its routine. Men laughed as they scooped steel bowls full, some mixing it with cake from supply ships, others inventing flavors by stirring in canned fruit. To them, it was just one more luxury in a war of plenty, no different from the cigarettes, Coca-Cola, or movies projected at night. But the symbolism was devastating. Even under attack, even as flames licked the decks of their carriers, the fleet returned to normalcy with dessert in hand. Word of this filtered back to Japan through captured documents and whispered reports. Intelligence officers scribbled bitter notes about the enemy's luxury morale. Propagandists tried to twist it into fuel for hatred. "See how decadent the Americans are, eating sweets while our youth give their lives." But the more they shouted, the more it exposed the fracture. Ordinary Japanese could not comprehend fighting such a war. Mothers wept at the idea of their starving sons ramming planes into ships that carried refrigerators and milk. The ice cream barge, though never intended as such, became a symbol of something greater than technology. It was proof of abundance, proof that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in the comfort it could afford to bring across oceans. For Japan's young pilots, that knowledge was like a blade in the heart. They were asked to die against an enemy who seemed untouchable, an enemy so wealthy that even in the apocalypse it could freeze milk and sugar into sweetness. Ulithi, summer 1945. The lagoon was alive with a rhythm that no war should have allowed. On one islet, sailors played baseball, their laughter carried over the water as coconut palms swayed above. On another, a canvas screen flickered with the latest Hollywood reels. Hundreds of men gathered barefoot in the sand, cheering when the heroine kissed the hero. Chaplains led hymns at dusk, their voices rising against the roar of engines as planes cycled endlessly from carriers. And always in the background, the low hum of the ice cream barge's compressors, a machine that never stopped, a factory of sweetness in the middle of chaos. The men lived in an odd duality. By day, they fought. Hellcats roared from decks, striking airfields, ships and cities. Kamikazes slammed into hulls, ripping men from their bunks, sending fire through steel corridors. They buried their dead at sea, the chaplain's words swallowed by waves. Yet within hours, the war receded into ritual. Baseball, movies, cigarettes. Ice cream in dented tin bowls. To outsiders, it might have looked like denial, but to the men of Ulithi, it was survival. The scale of abundance was staggering. Supply ships poured in from San Francisco and Pearl Harbor, carrying everything from spare engines to canned peaches. A floating dry dock swallowed entire cruisers, repaired them in days, and released them back to fight. Tankers pumped millions of gallons of oil as though the ocean itself had veins. And at the heart of it all, the barge turned out 5 tons of ice cream daily, its product spread equally among ranks, from admirals dining in wardrooms to deckhands scraping rust. In war, hierarchy was everything, except here. Ice cream was democracy in a spoon. Intercepted Japanese reports described Ulithi as a floating America, a city so vast it could not be destroyed. Pilots who glimpsed it before their final dives wrote that it looked endless, like a steel horizon without shore. The contrast to home was unbearable. In Japan, children boiled pine roots. At Ulithi, sailors topped ice cream with chocolate syrup shipped across 5,000 miles of ocean. For the Japanese command, Ulithi was a nightmare. proof that no matter how many kamikazes they sent, the Americans could not only rebuild, but continue living as if untouched. For the men who fought there, the sweetness was both comfort and declaration. We are not only surviving this war, we are thriving in it. By mid-1945, the Japanese homeland was burning. Night after night, B-29s droned across the skies, their bomb bays disgorging rivers of fire. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. Entire cities turned into furnaces. Wooden homes vanished in sheets of flame. Rivers boiled with corpses. Survivors clutched charred children, their skin hanging in ribbons. In Tokyo alone, 100,000 souls were incinerated in a single night, the smell of burned flesh drifting for miles. The land of the rising sun was reduced to ash. In the countryside, famine gnawed at the people. Rice was scarce, wheat scarcer still. Families ate millet, grass, even tree bark. Mothers scavenged weeds from ditches to boil into soup for their children. Men wasted away, their bones showing through uniforms that once carried pride. Disease swept the starving villages. The empire that had once dreamed of ruling Asia now dug in the dirt for food. And yet, across the Pacific, Ulithi still thrived. Tankers docked daily, filling the lagoon with the smell of diesel and gasoline. Dry docks repaired ships faster than Japan could destroy them. Mail ships brought letters from home, packages of candy, cakes and books, and the ice cream barge continued its endless rhythm. 10 gallons every 7 minutes, 5 tons every day. For Americans, the war was hell, but it was a hell softened by luxury. For Japan, it was starvation wrapped in fire. The psychological weight was unbearable. Pilots whispered about the futility of sacrifice. What use was crashing into a carrier when another floated nearby, fully supplied, untouched in spirit? What use was dying when the enemy's sailors could wash down dinner with ice cream, while their own comrades chewed on millet husks? Even commanders in private admitted despair. A senior officer in Kyushu wrote bitterly, "The enemy's abundance is not human. They fight with factories, not men. We sacrifice beyond blossoms, but blossoms do not stop steel." By the summer of 1945, the cracks in the empire were gaping wounds, cities in ruin, children starving, pilots flying to certain death on pine root fuel. Against this backdrop, Ulithi was not just a naval base, it was the embodiment of America's inexhaustible power. A floating city where sailors lounged on beaches, watched movies, and ate ice cream, even as Japan crumbled into dust. And in the shadows of that collapse, a question burned in every Japanese heart. How do you fight an enemy that can afford sweetness at the very end of the world? August 6, 1945. The sky above Hiroshima glowed white. In a heartbeat, an entire city vanished, reduced to silence, then screams. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed, its hills shrouded in black smoke and radioactive ash. The atomic age had arrived, and with it the end of Japan's desperate gamble. Cities were flattened, armies broken, fuel exhausted, families starving. The emperor's voice, carried across crackling radio waves, surrendered with words the Japanese had never heard before: "Endure the unendurable." Across the Pacific, Ulithi's lagoon stirred with motion. Carriers, battleships and destroyers weighed anchor, their crews gathering on decks to hear the news. Some wept openly, others simply stared at the horizon in silence. A war that had consumed the world was over. Yet even in that moment, the routines continued. Supply ships still unloaded crates, mechanics still hammered steel plates into shape, and from the deck of a concrete barge, compressors still churned, turning out gallons of ice cream as though nothing had changed. For the Americans, it was a symbol of resilience, proof that they could fight the most brutal war in history and still taste sweetness in the midst of it. For the Japanese, it was something far darker, a reminder that they had faced an enemy whose wealth, abundance, and industry were beyond imagining. While Japan's children dug roots from the earth, American sailors dipped spoons into frozen cream in the middle of the Pacific. That contrast had been the true death blow long before the mushroom clouds. Historians would later argue that ice cream was trivial compared to bombs, tanks, and planes, but to the men who lived it, the barge represented something elemental. It was not just dessert, it was a declaration. That America's war machine was so vast, so confident, that it could carry comfort into battle. That even as men died, others would line up in the sun for a scoop of vanilla or chocolate. It was abundance weaponized, morale engineered into sweetness. In the end, Japan was defeated not only by fire and steel, but by the crushing weight of disparity. Against starvation, there was sugar. Against despair, laughter. Against death poems, there were movies under palm trees. And in the heart of Ulithi's lagoon, 5 tons of ice cream a day. The war ended. The barge kept turning. And in its cold hum was the unspoken truth. Sometimes, victory tastes like sweetness in the middle of hell. The war was over, but Ulithi did not vanish overnight. The lagoon still held its floating metropolis for weeks, a steel city waiting for orders. Some ships sailed to occupy Japan, others ferried prisoners of war back across the Pacific. And still, the ice cream barge hummed. Day after day it produced frozen sweetness, as if the machine did not know the war had ended. For the sailors, the scoops tasted different now, not of comfort in hardship, but of survival itself. Each bite was a reminder that they had lived while so many others had not. In Tokyo Bay, Japanese officers stepped aboard the USS Missouri to sign surrender papers. Their faces were thin, their uniforms threadbare. They had walked through a land of ashes to reach the deck. Around them towered American admirals in pressed whites, their ships bristling with guns, their men well-fed, strong and unbroken. The gulf between victor and vanquished was impossible to ignore. For the Japanese, the shame of defeat was searing, but so too was the revelation. They had fought not just an army, but an empire of abundance, a nation that could build a floating city and still spare resources for ice cream while waging total war. After Ulithi emptied, the barge itself was quietly towed away, its mission complete. Most of the sailors who had lined up for its frozen cups never saw it again. Yet in letters, memoirs, and whispered sea stories, it lingered. Men spoke of it decades later as if it had been a dream. A machine of cold sweetness floating in the middle of the world's most savage battlefield. Veterans who stormed beaches and faced kamikazes remembered not only the terror, but the strange comfort of a scoop of vanilla in the heat of the Pacific sun. For Japan, the memory was different. The ice cream barge, once just a line in an intelligence report, became a symbol of what they had faced. An enemy that fought with fact, Tories, industry and morale, not desperation and sacrifice. Against a nation that could make sweetness in the middle of apocalypse, there had never been hope of victory. In the end, history remembered the mushroom clouds, the firebombs, the ruins. But beneath those shadows lay another truth, quieter, colder, almost absurd, that in the greatest war the world had ever seen, one of America's most devastating weapons was the simple power to make ice cream at sea.